Hello friends, welcome to my YouTube channel. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell icon so you never miss my latest videos. Let's get started with today's video. The Frost of Fate, the winter that never ended. Imagine a morning in July where you wake up not to the heat of the Maryland sun, but to 6 inches of snow burying your crops. Imagine a world where the sun is a pale, ghostly disk and the birds freeze mid-flight. In 1816, the United States didn't just face a bad season, it faced an apocalypse that history books often whisper about, but rarely scream. This is the true story of Thomas Miller, a man who walked into the white void of the year without a summer to save a family that the world had already written off as dead. The ash in the sky. The year was 1816, but in the small town of Vermont, it felt like the end of days. Thomas Miller wiped the soot from his brow, but it wasn't soot from his fireplace. It was volcanic ash that had traveled halfway across the globe from Mount Tambora. At the time, no one knew why the sky had turned a bruised purple. They only knew that the corn was dying in the fields and the cattle were rib-thin and wailing in the night. "Thomas, we can't stay," his wife Martha whispered. Her voice was as brittle as the frozen leaves outside. "The stores are empty. The neighbors are eating boiled leather." Thomas looked at his 2 children. Their eyes were sunken, dark pits of hunger. This was the Great Migration. Thousands of Americans were abandoning the East Coast, fleeing a phantom winter, heading toward the promised Ohio country. They called it Ohio Fever, a desperate hope that somewhere to the west the sun was still warm. The Ghost Trail. They set out in a rickety wagon, joining a caravan of ghosts. The historical accuracy of this journey is haunting. Along the trail, Thomas saw sights that would redefine Americans' resilience. He saw families trading their heirlooms, silver spoons from the Revolutionary War, for a single bag of moldy flour. The strangest part? The silence. Because the birds had died off in the frost of June, the American wilderness was eerily quiet. One night, near the Pennsylvania border, they encountered a man sitting by a frozen creek. He was a veteran of the 1812 war, his uniform in tatters. "Don't go forward," the veteran warned, his eyes wide. "The mountains have teeth this year. The snow doesn't melt, it just waits." The science of the dark. What Thomas didn't know, what no one in America knew, was that 10,000 miles away in Indonesia, a mountain had exploded with the force of 10,000 atomic bombs. The sulfur dioxide had created a global veil. This wasn't just a cold snap, this was the largest volcanic eruption in 1,300 years. Back in the States, the economy collapsed. This was the birth of the first Great American Depression. People were desperate. It was during this dark year that some of the most famous icons were born. For instance, because it was too cold to go outside, a young woman named Mary Shelley, stuck indoors in Europe, wrote Frankenstein. In America, it pushed the frontier forward by decades as people risked everything to escape the icy grip of the East. The spine of the world. The Appalachian Mountains were no longer a gateway, they were a graveyard. By August 1816, the migration had turned into a slow-motion funeral procession. Thomas Miller steered his oxen, their ribs protruding like the hull of a wrecked ship, through a mountain pass that should have been lush with summer laurel. Instead, it was choked with a gray, rhythmic sleet. "Thomas!" Martha called from inside the wagon. Her voice was thin, filtered through a wool shawl. The baby hasn't cried in 4 hours. He's too cold to even protest." Thomas didn't answer. He couldn't. His jaw was locked tight against the shivering. He looked at the trail ahead. Other families, the Appletons from Boston, the Kincaids from Virginia, were abandoning their belongings. He saw a mahogany piano, a family heirloom brought from England, sitting abandoned in a snowbank. It looked like a black tooth rotting in a white skull. Historical fact: during the summer of 1816, frost was reported in every single month in the Northeast. In June, a massive blizzard killed thousands of newly shorn sheep, and birds literally fell dead from the sky in Massachusetts. The encounter at Devil's Gap. As they reached the highest point of the pass, they encountered a barricade, not of wood, but of desperate men. A group of survivors had holed up in a series of caves. They were the Frostbitten, a nickname given to those who had lost their minds to the endless winter. Their leader, a man named Silas, with eyes as pale as the frozen creek, stepped forward. He wasn't holding a rifle, he was holding a bone. A soup bone, Thomas hoped. "Turn back, traveler," Silas rasped. "There is no Ohio. The sun has died in the west. We saw it sink behind the trees 3 days ago, and it didn't come back up red. It came back up gray." Thomas gripped his flintlock. "My children need to eat, Silas. Move the wagon, or I'll make sure you never see the sun again, gray or otherwise." The hunger and the hallucination. By September, the Miller family had reached the deep woods of Pennsylvania. The summer was officially over, though it had never truly begun. Hunger does strange things to the American mind. Thomas began to see things in the tree line. He saw tall, shimmering figures, the spirits of the forest, or perhaps just the optical illusions created by the volcanic ash refracting the dim sunlight. The survival tactics. To keep his children alive, Thomas resorted to frontier medicine. He bled the oxen slightly, mixing the blood with a handful of oats to create a nutrient-dense porridge. It was a technique learned from the old hunters, a grim necessity when the earth refused to give grain. One evening, they found a cabin. Smoke was rising from the chimney. They thought they were saved. But when Thomas entered, he found a family sitting at a table, perfectly preserved. They hadn't died of violence. They had died of ergotism. The historical twist. Because of the damp, freezing conditions, the little rye that did grow was infected with ergot, a fungus that causes hallucinations and gangrene. Many pioneers in 1816 went mad, believing they were possessed by demons, when in reality they were eating poisoned bread. Thomas backed out of the cabin, his heart hammering. He realized then that the cold wasn't the only enemy. The very land was turning toxic. The Great Pivot, the birth of the West. While the Millers struggled, the fabric of America was tearing and re-stitching. This wasn't just a story of a family, it was the story of a nation's birth pains. Because the crops failed in New England, the price of grain skyrocketed. This led to the collapse of the Federalist Party. People blamed the government for the lack of preparation. The rise of the Erie Canal. Leaders realized they needed to move food faster. Religious revival. Thousands believed this was the biblical plagues of Egypt, leading to the Second Great Awakening. Thomas didn't care about politics. He only cared about the glimmer of green he saw in a valley below. It was late September. For the first time in months, the gray veil in the sky parted for exactly 10 minutes. A beam of pure golden light hit the valley floor. "Martha, look!" Thomas screamed. The light revealed a small settlement. It wasn't Ohio yet, but it was a clearing, and in that clearing, a group of Native Americans, the original stewards of the land, were harvesting something the white settlers had ignored. Jerusalem artichokes, a root that grew deep underground, protected from the frost. The lesson of the earth. The Millers survived that winter not because they found a hidden paradise, but because they learned to look down instead of up. They traded their remaining silver for the knowledge of the root. As 1816 bled into 1817, the volcanic ash finally began to settle. The sun stayed out longer. The ghost year was ending, but the people who emerged from the woods were different. They were harder, more cynical, but infinitely more resourceful. Thomas Miller stood on his new plot of land in what would become the outskirts of Cleveland. He looked at his hands, scarred, blackened by frostbite, but steady. "We didn't just survive the winter," he told his son. "We survived the year God forgot."
The journey continues. As the frost of 1816 begins to recede, it leaves behind a landscape that is no longer recognizable. For Thomas Miller and the thousands of pioneers pushing into the American interior, the year without a summer was only the beginning of a larger transformation. The Great Thaw and the Black Floods. By March 1817, the sky finally began to shed its bruised purple hue. But the nightmare wasn't over. It simply changed its form. The massive accumulation of volcanic ash and unseasonable snow began to melt all at once. Thomas stood on a ridge overlooking the Ohio River Valley. What should have been a fertile basin was now a churning, chocolate-colored sea. The Black Floods of 1817 are a forgotten chapter of American tragedy. The water was thick with the carcasses of livestock and the splintered remains of cabins that hadn't been built high enough. "We prayed for the sun, Thomas," Martha said, clutching a tattered wool blanket. "But the sun is melting our world away." They had to move. The lowlands were death traps of typhoid and cholera, diseases that thrived in the stagnant, warming waters. This forced the Great Migration even further west, pushing the American frontier into the deep, dark forests of Indiana and Illinois. It was a forced expansion, driven by the desperation of a people who could no longer trust the climate of their birthplaces. The birth of American ingenuity. In the face of total agricultural collapse, the American spirit did something unexpected. It innovated. Thomas Miller was among the first to realize that the old ways of farming, planting by the lunar calendar and relying on English seeds, were dead. In a small settlement near what would become Cincinnati, Thomas met a man who would change his life, a wandering tinkerer with a bag of hardened seeds. The historical innovation. Because of the 1816 freeze, American farmers began to develop hardy, short-season crops. They started breeding corn that could mature in 90 days instead of 120. They looked toward the iron plow, a heavy metal tool that could cut through the frozen, clay-heavy soils of the Midwest that wooden plows had shattered against. Thomas spent his last silver coins on a prototype of a cast-iron plowshare. It was heavy, ugly, and hard to pull, but it was the only thing that could break the earth of glass. This was the moment the Midwest began its journey toward becoming the breadbasket of the world. The secret society of the frost-burned. As towns began to sprout from the mud, a strange subculture emerged among the survivors. They called themselves the frost-burned. These were men and women who had survived the mountain passes by eating bark, leather, and, in whispered rumors, worse. Thomas noticed them in every new settlement. They had a look in their eyes, a permanent 1,000-yard stare. They didn't trust the spring. Even in the heat of July 1817, they wore heavy coats. They were the first preppers in American history. One night, a man approached Thomas's campfire. It was Silas, the man from the mountain cave. He looked different now, cleaner, but his hands were missing 3 fingers from frostbite. "You think it's over, Thomas?" Silas asked, gesturing to the clear, starry sky. The mountain in the east, the one that blew its top, it changed the blood of the earth. We are living on borrowed time. Silas wasn't just rambling. He represented a massive shift in American theology. The year without a summer sparked the Great Disappointment and several religious movements that believed the end of the world was imminent. It created a sense of manifest destiny laced with a dark, apocalyptic urgency. The legacy in the soil. By 1820, the Miller farm was thriving. The ghost year was a fading memory for many, but for Thomas it was etched into his very bones. His children were taller now, but they never wasted a single crumb of bread. They had seen the bottom of the world. The surprising historical connection. The migration caused by 1816 wasn't just about moving people, it moved ideas. Joseph Smith, his family was forced to move from Vermont to Palmyra, New York, because of the 1816 crop failures. Without that move, the Mormon faith might never have been founded. The Erie Canal, completed in the wake of this disaster, became the information superhighway of the 19th century. Thomas Miller died in 1845, a wealthy man by frontier standards. On his deathbed, he didn't talk about his riches. He talked about the taste of the Jerusalem artichoke, the bitter, earthy root that saved his children when the sun went out. The Hidden Diary, the final hook. In 1922, a construction crew in Columbus, Ohio, unearthed a lead box buried beneath the foundation of an old barn. Inside was a leather-bound diary, its pages brittle but legible. It belonged to Thomas Miller. The final entry, dated December 31, 1816, contained a sentence that still haunts historians today. The snow has turned black again tonight. I heard a sound from the woods that was not a wolf and not a man. It sounded like the earth itself was screaming for the sun. If this is my last entry, let it be known, we did not leave the East because we wanted to. We left because the East died, and we are the ghosts wandering into a new world.
The final chapter of this saga doesn't just end with Thomas Miller. It bridges the gap between a frozen past and the modern superpower we know today. This is the epilogue, the ghost in the machine of America. The Echo in the Heartland, 1916. Exactly 100 years after the year without a summer, a man named Elias Miller, Thomas's great-grandson, stood on the same porch in Ohio. The world was at war in Europe, and the American Midwest was now the literal lungs of the global food supply. Elias held his great-grandfather's heavy cast-iron plowshare, now a rusted relic in the barn. He looked at the golden wheat field stretching to the horizon. It was a scorching July day in 1916. The irony was not lost on him. Where Thomas saw white death, Elias saw golden life. But the ghost year had left a permanent mark on the Miller DNA. Even a century later, the family cellars were overstocked. They never trusted a clear sky. They were the architects of a new American psyche, the survivalist. The hidden architecture of a superpower. Historians often look at wars to explain how America became a giant, but they forget the volcanic winter of 1816. This single year of frost did more to shape the United States than a dozen battles. The death of the gentleman farmer. Before 1816, American farming was a relaxed, Jeffersonian ideal. After 1816, it became an industry. The trauma of the frost pushed Americans to invent the grain elevator, the refrigerated rail car, and the massive silos of the Midwest. America learned that to survive, it had to overproduce. This surplus mentality eventually fueled the Industrial Revolution. The hidden leak of the West. If the sun had stayed warm in 1816, the pioneers might have stayed in Vermont and Virginia for another 50 years. The frost was a centrifugal force, flinging people like Thomas Miller across the Mississippi. It accelerated the manifest destiny by decades, carving out states like Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan in a desperate frozen fever. The final mystery of the ash. In the late 19th century, scientists took ice cores from Greenland. They found a dark, thin line buried deep in the ice, a layer of sulfur and ash from 1816. When they compared the chemical signature of that ash to the soil samples from the old Miller farm in Ohio, they found something chilling. The ash wasn't just on the ground, it had been absorbed into the very oak trees that Thomas had planted. The houses built from those trees literally had the year without a summer trapped in their wooden veins. The final twist. Thomas Miller's diary, found in the lead box, contained one last drawing on the very back cover. It wasn't a map of his farm or a portrait of Martha. It was a sketch of the sun, but with a face that was weeping. Underneath, he had written a single line in Latin. Ignis aurum probat, miseria fortes viros. Fire tests gold, adversity tests brave men. Conclusion: the sun that never sets. The story of the year without a summer is not a story of a natural disaster. It is the origin story of the American will. When the sky turned black and the crops turned to ice, the people didn't give up. They moved. They didn't starve. They invented. They didn't die. They became the ghosts that built the cities of the West. Today, when an American buys a loaf of bread that lasts for weeks or sees a massive grain silo towering over the prairie, they are seeing the legacy of 1816. We are all children of the frost, living in a world built by men like Thomas Miller, who walked into the dark and refused to stop walking until they found the light.